in my experience, a lot of folks that have a fairly non-biblical view of the end times, and I say that because it's clear they don't study once you start talking to them, or they haven't studied much. One of the views that they have is that somehow, some way, the Antichrist will be Islamic, all while ignoring the fact that, again, anti means replacement for and opposed to. So he will be a false Christ that is fostered as the savior of Christianity and Judaism at once, right? Because, again, this is something that I think is a simple facet of biblical knowledge in the book of Daniel, but he signs a 7-year peace treaty for the ostensible, the on the surface benefit of Israel against, in this case, what I'm going to discuss, a southern invader. Southerly mostly, not that it's entirely so, but when we look in Daniel, for example, Daniel describes all of this wonderfully. Thank God for that book. It is amazing. Daniel 11 describes Antiochus and Antichrist as essentially the two being one, in that Antiochus is and I've noted this before in other videos, but Antiochus is the tightest knit version of Antichrist in the entire Bible. All of the Antichrists throughout the Bible, when you put them all together, their character is a full picture of Antichrist, as much as you can see, while essentially melding all of their personalities together. We're talking, Nimrod, we're talking, of course, Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Assyria, king of Tyre. The list goes on, and honestly, it peaks with Antiochus for a very good reason. Because not only was Antiochus the greatest overall example of the major personality traits of Antichrist in one person, but it also prophetically delineated how Antichrist comes to power and what his again, on the surface crusade will look like while going up against what Daniel 11 calls the King of the South. So let's get into this real quick. So all throughout Daniel 11, you see basically the line of the Seleucids against the line of the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies and the Seleucids both technically were Greek. They were the essential, the four horns, if you will, that spread out from Alexander the Great's previously massive conquered kingdom that he managed to do in about 11 years, which was how his particular kingdom is described as fast and furious and kind of out of nowhere, the leopard, right? So Antiochus, technically Seleucus, and Ptolemy separated the kingdoms north and south. There were two other portions of the kingdom, but they're not mentioned in these prophecies because, technically speaking, they're mostly irrelevant in the historical precedent being set by the original Antiochus and the Ptolemies, in that both Ptolemy and Antiochus, the Seleucids, they had larger lands by far. They were dominant over much greater period of time and people. So, and also, most importantly, they both took turns being in charge of the land of Palestine, Israel, as it is on our maps today. So basically, the north would get a win, they'd take over. The south would get a win, they would take over, and vice versa. Much the same way Antichrist is seen as the white rider on the horse with the bow. Initially, he's received as a hero, and the reasoning is, if we look in Daniel 11 again, Daniel 11, about 20 on, there's basically a story of Antiochus going to war with the south for the favor of Israel, right? So there's this 7-year treaty signed. The king of the north, in this case, Antiochus, Antichrist, goes to war with the Ptolemies. We have a historical schism there that is not perfectly aligned with our reality today. If we're being honest and we're looking at the world the way that it's set up now, who's at war with Israel? It's the Muslim nations versus the Jewish/Christian establishment of Israel and the United States and the West at large, who support the modern state of Israel. It is very, very difficult, I think, for anybody, if they take all of these factors into consideration, to see how the King of the North is going to represent, essentially revive Rome once it's put back in its place. You know, it's right now it's disparate kingdoms, but 7 horns rise out of the north, out of Daniel 7, remember, and then 3 come out of the south. And remember, in Nebuchadnezzar's statue, there are 7 toes of iron representing 7 extremely, in this case, technologically advanced and superior in many, many ways countries, versus the 3 clay toes of the south, which are not only pictured as brittle, meaning relatively speaking, it can be inferred, and I think it's fair to say, that the technological and sociological advancements of the North are very much greater than those of the South. And it shows because anybody who's ever worked with iron knows clay and iron under no circumstance can ever mix. So it's a picture of 2 cultures that are so diametrically opposed to one another in so many ways, but that they're all put in a line of 10, that at some point during the end of the era, in other words, the end times, when Antichrist has finished his what comes out to be 2 campaigns in Daniel. I'm going to read those scriptures here in a second so you can see that the 10 toes in total basically make up the entirety of Antichrist's kingdom, in that at some point he, just like the little horn who throws down 3 horns, 3 kings before him, those 3 horns are equal to those 3 toes, and they're subsumed into that 10 nation block, which makes up the entirety of Antichrist's established dominion after he finally defeats the king of the south. Now, I've made mention of this name or this title before in other videos if you followed me for a while. If not, I'm going to try and put the links in here so you guys can see. But the Islamic nations believe that a warrior king of sorts is going to rise, much like a version of Jesus, if you will. Although Muslims do hold that Jesus came from God and went back to heaven, they don't hold that he's the Messiah or that he actually is God. They're waiting for one that is sent by their God Allah to come and basically defeat the Jewish and Christian nations, which in this case are represented by the King of the North, his northern block of nations, Rome revived, and Babylon, which, again, if you've been following me for a while, there's really only one place that Babylon could be, considering the lay of the land, globally speaking. The United States is the only country that qualifies for that. And again, I'll put those videos in there. I'll also mention where in these verses we're going to go over, it actually points towards the United States of today being Mystery Babylon as well. So that theme is repeated all throughout Scripture, and it's good to constantly make sure that you've got the chess pieces in place. Otherwise, the end time scheme won't make sense. But there will be a great deception that's coming right now. Everybody online is saying, you know, the Antichrist will be Islamic, and that's just not true. The reason I could say that, aside from all these verses we're about to go over, is because nobody in the West and nobody in Christian culture and nobody in Jewish culture for sure is going to follow anyone of the Muslim faith. They're not. They're so diametrically opposed, just like those 3 toes and the 3 toes of clay and the 10 toes of iron. There's just no way they're ever going to mix, and it's been set up that way intentionally, by the way. If in fact it is a false religion, because it is, it was fostered by Satan, right? And Satan has known this end game for thousands of years, probably since the beginning, almost 6,000 years ago. We have mentioned in Genesis 3 that your seed will attack his seed, very much specifically talking about how Antichrist, the ultimate seed of Satan, will attack the seed of man, the ultimate son of man, Jesus Christ, the God-man, but his head will be crushed, and he won't make it through. So let's go through the scriptures real quick. I think this is excellent. So just to review, Genesis 49:17 very much makes mention, with the exact same verbiage from that Genesis 3 verse, by Jacob about Dan, basically telling him that he will be a serpent by the roadside, a viper in the grass, essentially, that bites the horse's heel so that its rider tumbles backwards. The fact that he's called a viper, a serpent, is not to be missed. That is another way of referring back to the Genesis 3 trickery that occurred that led to the fall of our parents. And Antichrist being represented by a snake is another way of saying you are the seed of your father. That's hard to miss. I think it's easy for me to see, might not be easy for you, but there is more. Deuteronomy 33:12, Dan is a lion's whelp or cub. Another way of saying a minusculized, almost version, if you will, of a lion, because a lion cub is much easier to take down, much weaker, but can still represent itself as a lion. Springing forth out of Bashan. Bashan was an area known for its pagan idolatry. It was a place where the Danites and a few portions of other tribes actually defected to and became entrenched in the idolatry and the pagan worship and child sacrifice and all the other disgusting things that they did. And it's not a good thing to be associated with Bashan. So the fact that Dan is shown as essentially copying his older brother, Judah in this case, where the lion of the tribe of Judah represents the ultimate member of that tribe, our Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, it's no wonder that he would make this statement, because Dan, in the person of Antichrist, is going to be a false Messiah. He's going to be a replacement, fake version that truly is ultimately against the true Christ. So Daniel 11:29 and 30. These are some excellent verses. Most typical translations have this, they have it kind of backwards. Not entirely so, but I'm going to read this real quick and go over it. At the appointed time, he will invade the south again, but this time the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he will lose heart. Now that's where the translation gets mucky. I'm going to finish the verse and then go back. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So, first off, ships of the western coastlands will oppose him. Will oppose him is a Aramaic word that can be seen one of two ways, depending on the context that it's written. In Antiochus's original foray into the south, when he was actually going into, I believe it was Alexandria, and was about to basically go tell Ptolemy, surrender or die, representatives, actual senators from Rome came, drew a circle in sand around Antiochus and said, before you leave this circle, you're going to give us an answer that you are not going to attack the south. Otherwise, we are going to take our ships, which at the time, by the way, the western coastlands, the farthest reaches, did include the Roman Empire, which went all the way out to the very edges of España or Spain, Portugal, and so on. Cyprus and all of these western territories were all represented in this case by Rome. So watch this. That phrase can also mean join in battle with him, right? So it's a two-phased meaning, which is perfectly apt for these prophecies, because again, they apply to both Antiochus and to Antichrist. Now, after Antiochus had this happen, he returned and basically lost his mind and started forcing Hellenization, Greek culture, on the Jewish people, and became the madman that he eventually came to be known as, Epimanes. Started slaughtering pigs to a false symbol of Zeus in the temple, sat down himself, calling himself God. All of the terrible things that make him most like Antichrist came as a direct result of this occurrence. Now, that being said, in the case of actual Antichrist, not Antiochus, the ships themselves are seen as supporting him. We know this because shortly after these verses, there's a divergence between what has already occurred with Antiochus that we can look back in history and actually say that actually was fulfilled, but this portion was not. This is the part where it starts to diverge. And also, too, there's a greater detail that's given in Daniel 11:40 through 43, which I'm going to read now. But just know that 11:29 through 30 is also misrepresented in that the part where it says he will lose heart, it's actually a verb phrase that means he will be stricken as if dead. So it's another reference to Revelation and the wound that miraculously so-called is healed. This is actually directly where that prophecy is mirrored, both Old Testament to New. So if our translators were doing a better job, we would see that Antichrist is actually said to have this mortal head wound in Daniel as well. But again, we don't. This is the NIV 84 just because it's the easiest to read, but no other major translation has that, and it's a really big problem. You guys can study that more. Again, I will put the links in the description of the video if you want this. So Daniel 11:40-43, at the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. A great fleet of ships. Now, Antiochus, if you guys know, the king of the north essentially went up, his entire, his area of dominance started in Macedon. It incorporated some of the coastline, but primarily was an inland empire, right? So Antiochus at the time was not known for having a very big navy. And actually, in fact, the reason why he went back originally and was so enraged with the people in Israel was because he probably believes that the people in Israel likely told on him to the Romans. And at the time, the Romans were known for having ships and being a seafaring people. If you look at the Roman, or I guess Roman Peninsula or Italian Peninsula as it is today, it's all sea exposed. So you would absolutely assume that a nation like that, mostly on the water, would have an exceptional navy, and they did. But in this case, in Daniel 11:40, you can clearly see that he will return with many ships. Antiochus did not have that ability. He never, in fact, returned anywhere with any significant amount of ships, because in this case, much like the duality of the application of that phrase, will oppose him, will go with him, from Daniel 11:30, they very much show here that they're going with him, in this case, in the person of Antichrist, against the king of the south, what has been known as the Madhi. And let's go on from there, because you'll see more. It gets even more. It gets even more in depth. Great fleet of ships. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. This, by the way, is a reference to the land where Israel will be fleeing into the desert and protected for 1,260 days. That is the area where they are supposed to flee, by the way, as an aside. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver, of all the riches of Egypt, with the Libyans and Nubians in submission. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that these three kingdoms, these three nations, these three relative lands, Egypt, Libya, and Nubia, which basically encompasses all of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, Egypt proper, and most of North Africa. I'm not saying that those necessarily will comprise the three kings, but it is entirely possible. We won't know what the three kings of the south that support the king of the south, the Madhi, will look like until the time comes. But clearly we can see that there are a series of nations that very much hate Israel and want it to not exist today. They will soon come together in some sort of series of power blocks, three major ones, to support the king of the south, specifically to go against the Antichrist. So yeah, that's about I think the summation of it. We need to be aware of these things, because part of the great deception in the end, just like the Lord said, there will be many Christs, false Christs, that come before I do. One of the false Christs is going to be the Madhi, the king of the south. And one of the great ways which Antichrist will clearly subsume the Christian West and the Jewish Middle East into his fold to go against the king of the south is it's being made out to look like another version of the Crusades, only this time with technology the way that it is, and with the armies of the West and all the navies that are involved. It's going to be utter, absolute, subjective destruction. And not to go too far, because I'm going to put the links to the two battles between the king of the north and the south in the notes here. But the picture is, the first battle involves a huge land mass, basically the area of Egypt, being wiped out, but that the end result of that first battle essentially being a draw. The second one will essentially land just north of Israel in the land of Syria. It will involve mass technology, mass ships, and utter destruction of the king of the south, with the intended result of bringing all of the southern nations, all of the Muslim countries, under Antichrist's leadership and dominance, which, as I've opined elsewhere, will likely lead to a lot of people not only rejecting Islam, but also accepting Christ. And though it may lead to their martyrdom, that's the best we can hope that would come from these wars. And after that's done, basically beginning of the second half of the tribulation, he goes and kills Moses and Elijah, and the 144,000 get hunted. And this is after the believing Jews that are left in Israel flee to the mountains. So didn't want to make this video too long, but there's a lot of information here. I will do what I can to make sure I put those other video links in the description here so you guys can see. It's excellent. It's a wonderful breakdown. It's very in-depth, it's very information heavy, but I think it's worth your read. We must keep eyes open and not be deceived, and most of y'all won't even make it this far in the video, but those of you that do, you are blessed. I hope you use this information to warn the brothers. Anyway, let me know how I did. Comment, like, share, subscribe, YouTube stuff, you know. How about that weather out there? It's starting to look pretty again. Talk to you guys soon. Bless y'all.